Hello everyone, this is going to be the last lecture of day 4, and in this presentation we are going to be talking about questioning. So first, let's start off. What exactly is questioning? If we remember from the initial lectures from day 3 before, we talked about the period after speeches in which the speaker of the speech has to be questioned by the chamber for 1 minute. Now, it's a bit different for the first affirmative speech and the first negative speech. They get 2 minutes. So for the first two speeches, you're always going to have a questioning period of 2 minutes and 1 minute for everything else. As a brief review, the questioning period is when the speaker comes up and gets questioned by whoever wants to in the chamber. There are really two types of questioning here. There's going to be indirect questioning and direct questioning. Indirect questioning is when each congressperson gets to have one opportunity to ask one question, and then we move on to the next speaker. In direct questioning, each person gets 30 seconds to ask the speaker questions. Throughout this camp, we'll be using indirect questioning, so everyone gets to have one question to ask the speaker, and then they sit back down. So first, let's kind of point out the purpose of questioning here, and for the most part, is to make yourself look good. Because if you remember, Congress is an event in which you have to stand out from the crowd. You want to be able to appeal to the judges and show that you are the best in the room. So, a first purpose of questioning is to be able to lead into your own arguments. During this time, it's a very effective lead-in. If you can plant the first initial seed of an idea of that argument into the judge's mind during questioning, then when you review it again later on in a later speech, the judge will go back to the questioning period and remember, oh yeah, I remember that argument. And it's gonna stand out a lot more to them. Because first, they've heard it before, and second, because they've heard it before, it's gonna make more sense to them. But second, when you're questioning, you really want to speak intelligently. Well, what do I mean by that? You want to be first very clear in what you're trying to say, but second of all, you also want to show your knowledge on the topic to the judges to demonstrate that you have a lot of knowledge and you know what you're talking about. But of course, there's always going to be some refutation mixed in here. So really the main point of questioning when it comes to refutation is to point out holes in the opponent's arguments. So you might be asking, well, why not just make an argument during the questioning period? And it's because for the most part, it's a questioning period, right? You don't make arguments, you simply ask questions that might point out some faulty points in your opponent's arguments. We'll get to that a bit more later. But for the most part, that's the purpose of questioning, to make yourself look good and to kind of refute your opponent's points so you don't have to actually do it during your speeches. That way, you can refute your opponent's points during questioning and be able to focus on your own points and make yourself stand out during your actual speeches here. As a general rule of thumb, it's probably good if you can try to combine these two into one question. So if you refute a point very nicely with a very good question, you'll also make yourself look good. So let's cover the do's and don'ts of questioning. So for the do's, first, make your questions concise and clean. What do I mean by that? Well, when you're asking a question, you want to convey information very cleanly here. And also, just a short, nice question is a good question that judges can appreciate. That way, you can get your point across effectively and be a good speaker. The second thing you want to do is be able to box people in. Well, when you want to have a question, you don't really just want to ask any type of question, right? You want to have a question with a purpose in mind. So for example, on the climate change bill, I want to specifically pin down an argument. Thus, I would use a question to make sure that my opponent is drawn to a certain part of the argument, right? So they can't just talk about climate change in general, they have to talk about a specific part of climate change. Maybe how the fossil fuel industry is incentivized towards climate change. The third thing you really should be doing when it comes to questioning is being nice. First, if you're being nice, you're more likely to be a lot more receptive. The judges are going to be a lot more receptive to what you say. But second of all, just being nice also makes the person you're questioning a lot more receptive to your points here. Remember, in Congress, a lot of times you might be debating with someone on one bill, but later on you might be agreeing with them. You don't want anyone to hold any bad will towards you. Now let's talk about the don'ts. The first off is do not start off with a huge lead or fact. There's a couple of reasons for this. First, as a general rule of thumb, judges don't like this. They tend to be pretty boring questions, and they aren't that great. Even if it's such an amazing fact, you should probably save it for your speeches. And that's because of the fact when you ask a question and you start off with this huge fact, such a great fact that you think kills an argument, you're giving your opponent a direct way to respond to that argument because they give a response right after you give the question. If it's such a good fact or such a good response to an argument, you might as well wait until your speeches, make it very quickly, and then move on to your own arguments. At that point, the shock value of that argument is a lot more clear, especially since your opponents can't directly respond to it right after you've given it. Second of all, never ramble. Rambling is bad because A, it makes you look like you don't know what you're talking about, but second of all, you're going to lose the interest of both the speaker and your judges here. This is because for the most part, when you ramble, everyone tunes out, no one listens, and the question gets get lost in the midst of a Congress round. Especially when Congress rounds last very long, around 3 to 4 hours, you need to make sure that you can keep people's attention for a very short period of time. But the third thing is, do not ask open-ended questions. So you might be asking, doesn't this contradict the first point when you say do not start off with a huge lead? Well, I'll show you in some examples that's not necessarily true, but you never want to give free rein to the speaker as to how he wants to or he or she wants to respond to the question. If you ask open-ended, that just really gives them a lot more opportunities to expand upon their own points and establish how good they are as a speaker and how good their arguments are, instead of making the focus on you. So overall, that question is not that great. Let's move on to the next one. So for the second example, we have, without a carbon tax, how will you solve climate change? So how's this question? Well, for the most part, it's an okay question. It's better than the last one because it's a bit more narrow, right? In this case, you're focusing on what are the alternatives to a carbon tax. The issue with this question is if your opponent or the speaker has done research, they probably will have an alternative in mind, a response to that question, because it's probably a point that they're expecting or have heard before. So, while it might be a bit more focused than the last question, it still gives the opponent a lot of time or a lot of space to be able to loop back around to their own points and talk about how great their arguments are. So now we'll talk about the final question, the final example. What alternatives are there to climate change that can incentivize the fossil fuel industry to change as much as a carbon tax? As you can probably tell, this one's a lot more better than all the rest because it's really specific, right? In this case, you narrow the topic down to what alternatives are there that are better than a carbon tax in moving the fossil fuel industry here. I would say this question really hits a sweet spot in how specific it is. On one hand, it nails down on a very small topic and an aspect of that topic, right? The topic is alternatives and it nails down to how do alternatives really deal with the fossil fuel industry. On the other hand, it isn't too constrictive, right? It isn't saying that, oh, it's a yes or no question. Those type of questions usually tend to be very unfair and abusive, and judges don't like that. So I would say this question is a fair question that's not too abusive, but makes your opponent answer the question honestly here. And the reason it's a good question is not because it just traps the opponent into a box, but it leads up to a very good argument, right? It leads up to the argument saying that the carbon tax is the only way to shift the fossil fuel industry to change and try to solve climate change, right? And that's the argument that you would probably make in your speech and make yourself look really good. So now go out, go to your breakout rooms and go practice. Try to integrate some of these tips we've talked about and make some of your own really good questions.